Welcome to Rangeland Principles today at the University of Idaho. My name is April Hewlett, and I'm joined by Dr. Karen Launchbaugh.
Yeah, hello. April and I have been teaching this all semester. We're looking forward to bring this to the end.
Yes, and today we're going to talk about forces of change. And if you'll recall, we talked about some of the values of rangelands and some of the things that can change earlier on, but we're just going to go into a little bit more depth today. So when we think about change, it can be good change or bad change, or maybe even
Or it doesn't change at all. I mean, you can't always tell. It'll just kind of stay the same. It becomes static. So, yeah, and it's so hard to tell.
Yeah, and so we have to think about both those pros and those cons to any kind of action. So I want you to think, what are some of the things that might change rangelands, both natural and maybe human causes? So here's a slide that kind of goes through a few of the different things that could change. This isn't everything, but it is a few things. So obviously fire, whether that's a prescribed fire or a wildfire, it's going to change the ecosystem. It's going to alter our plant communities, which can be favorable or unfavorable depending on the situation, but it's going to change the ecosystem.
Right. Another one is herbivory, and we've talked a lot about this. And this picture shows cows. When we think of herbivory, we think cows, but remember, insects and wildlife, all of those are animals that graze on range, and they can change the range. It's a powerful force.
Definitely. And then we have invasion, and this can be invasion by noxious weeds or any kind of plants that we don't want to come into the range for a certain objective that we have in that area.
Or even invasion of insects or animals or diseases. Those are all aspects of the invasion that can affect the plants.
Yeah, and these kind of all can impact one another as well. So we definitely see trends where we have fire. A lot of times we have higher invasion potential in certain sites. So it's not exclusive to one or the other. Human uses is an interesting one. We talked about urban development earlier on in class. If you recall back to the survey, most people were, or urban development was the least valued on rangeland, but it's definitely something we have to consider, and we're seeing more of that spread into these more rural areas, or we're having that wildland urban interface areas where we have to be concerned about both life and property as well as our natural resources.
Yeah, and if you had a chance, you probably heard the presentation about climate change that Dr. Strand did for this class. And we don't know exactly how climate will change rangelands. It certainly will be different from place to place, but we do know that the climate is changing, and that's having an influence on the plants.
Yeah.
And the animals, yeah.
And the animals. It's going to be really interesting to see what it does in our ecosystem.
Yeah, we're going to see it.
So when we think about all these forces that can change rangelands, we also have to think about the services and products that rangeland provides, and what do these different changes or forces do or have an effect on these different services and products. So thinking about services and products, I mean, this is just another list. It's not everything, but it's things that we think about quite a bit. Forage for livestock is an important thing. It's economically viable in the state of Idaho and around the West. We want to make sure that we keep quality forage out in our range.
Yeah, and some of these are things that and wildlife habitat, those are what they call provisioning services. If you read the materials for this class, there's a section of things that what do the services provide. Other ecosystem services mitigate the environment, like watershed practices that create infiltration, etc. Biodiversity, open space. I don't know what kind of service that is, but it's definitely important to people.
Yeah, and along with open space, kind of preserving the picture of the West that people have seems to be a really big driver, at least for the recreational industry.
Yeah, you bet.
And, you know, we want to make sure that we consider that when we're thinking about these forces that change our rangelands. So then we think about what tools we have for management, and it's not surprising that these tools are going to be similar to the tools that the forces that we just talked about that naturally change our ecosystem. So tools as managers, you can use fire. Remember, there's pros and cons to fire, and it's a natural process or disturbance that our plants can tolerate, except when we get into more of a short fire regime where we start to see more damage. Livestock grazing is another great tool. We've seen a lot of examples of utilizing livestock grazing as a management tool. In this class, specifically looking at fine fuel management was one of the big ones we looked at.
Yeah, other ones, including weed management. We had a whole section on invasive weed management, cooperative weed management areas, etc. We have human impacts, and so you have to think about how do we manage human impacts. Well, we do that by having, like, if you work for the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service, you spend some time developing travel plans, because travel plans is where humans are going to have an impact on the range. Or you might have in cities, or you mentioned the wildland urban interface, there might be zoning practices that allow certain practices on different kinds of land. So we don't have a lot of influence on human impacts, but we can decide what happens on what kinds of land, and then we can have travel plans. And then, your area is a restoration, so what kinds of things do we have restoration tools?
Well, there's a lot of different restoration tools that we have, from manipulating different vegetation types using mechanical treatments. There's herbicide. There's using, like we talked about, biological controls to manipulate certain vegetation. There's different seeding equipment to get different plant species back, and there's quite a few tools available to us. We still have to work within the realm of these natural changes, which becomes more difficult, right? We still are very dependent on climate, for example, our precipitation, our temperature, and that determines a lot of times whether we're successful or unsuccessful.
It's interesting to me that we started this class with the definition of rangeland management, which is the stewardship of rangeland resources to meet the needs and demands of society. So those needs and demands of society are those ecological services and resources, and these are those tools that we managers use to meet those demands. And some people are good at fire. I work in grazing, you work in restoration, other people work in weed management, you work some in weed management too. A whole other set of people, like J.D. Wolfforth, for example, really think about humans and how do they make decisions on land. So this is the end of kind of bringing it all together, that these are the tools that we use as rangeland managers. And so it's a very complex and interactive and multitasking thing, but it's a pretty important, since it covers half the earth, being able to provide for humans is a pretty important use of these tools.
Yeah, I think it's the exciting part too, is we have to think about the dynamic relationship between all of these when we're doing any kind of management, and make sure we consider those multiple uses and the values that people have, and trying to, like you said, be the best range managers we can, thinking about this complex issue.
I had a professor once that he said, well, if you want a simple job, don't go into range management.
Yeah.
But if you like dynamics and you like trying to meet people's needs and work on a lot of things together, it's a good one. That's why I chose range. How about you?
Yeah, that's why I chose range, and it's always changing.
Yeah.
So it changes by different site potentials and people, and it's exciting. It's a great field.
It is.